You all joining us from near and far this afternoon and evening, depending on where you're connecting from, as we remember the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor with our two-part series, Rising from the Ashes. This talk today features Daniel Martinez, Chief Historian for the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, and he will discuss the salvage effort that took place at Pearl Harbor following that attack nearly 80 years ago. Just wanted to go over a few housekeeping rules before we get started. One is please mute yourself if you haven't done so already. We will be accepting questions throughout the presentation in the chat box, which is found at the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in there as we go along or save them for the end. I will read those questions out loud for Daniel to answer following his presentation. To help with the view, please make sure that your screen is in speaker view until the Q&A portion. That just gives you a better glimpse at the photos that will be shared along with the presentation. And last of all, we hope you have a beverage of choice, a cup of coffee to sit back and relax and enjoy the presentation. I will now turn it over to our President and CEO, Mike Carr of the USS Missouri Memorial Association.
Yes, good morning and afternoon or good evening, depending upon where you're from. Thanks very much for joining us, and thank you, Jacqueline and Annette, for setting all of this up. As Jacqueline mentioned, 1 week from today is the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Today we're going to hear the incredible story of the effort that went into the salvage project that engaged to raise the entire Pacific fleet of 21 damaged and sunken U.S. Navy vessels. 2 of those ships still rest here in the waters of Pearl Harbor, the Arizona and the Utah, serving as relics and memorials to this tarnished day in history. Joining us today is Daniel Martinez, the Chief Historian of the Pearl Harbor National Memorial. We'll share a story why these 2 sunken ships are so important to our society as material culture. We'll discuss why these monuments exist specifically to transport us to a place where we otherwise cannot go, preserving a moment that will never die. Dan has been the Chief Historian of the U.S. Arizona Memorial since 1989, and I think Dan and I have known one another since then. Dan is a native of Los Angeles, and he attended Cal State Dominguez Hills, where he got a degree in history, and currently he's getting his master's program from the Naval War College. Dan is a resource for many, many World War II organizations, including the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, as well as the World War II Foundation, and is a great, great friend of the Battleship Missouri Memorial, just recently serving as one of our keynote speakers for our September 2nd ceremony, which recognized the end of World War II, which ended right here on the decks of the Missouri. So without further ado, let me introduce a great friend of the Missouri and a friend of mine, Mr. Daniel Martinez.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I'd like to welcome all of you that are online and watching this program that I'm about to present to you. One of the things about Pearl Harbor is its aftermath, and the image you're looking at right now is an image of the naval station at Pearl Harbor, this naval base, and you're looking right down on the center of it. Ford Island, you can see in the try to get my laser pointer to work here. So let's see. There we go. Ford Island is right here. And this is a naval air station, Pearl Harbor. It's often misreferred, but here along the sides of the island are the moorings for Battleship Row right here. On the opposite side, the moorings in that day, the Raleigh, the Detroit, the Utah, and the Tangier. Across from that is Pearl City Peninsula. Some of you who are aviation buffs would like to know that right in this area is where the seaplane from Pan American, when you cross the Pacific you would first land at Pearl Harbor if you were leaving from the West Coast and land in this lagoon right here. And that's the Pearl City Peninsula. All around you are moorings for the ships of the Pacific Fleet. The primary naval station is here. And over here is the submarine base. And all of these you can see is rather open. The channel is very narrow. Only one capital ship could come in or out. So this parade of ships, if they were coming in, would come right down the channel here to the
Sorry, Daniel, I think we muted you accidentally. Can you just click on your speaker symbol? There you go.
Hey, where should I pick up?
You're about 10 seconds ago.
Okay, I wanted to just take you as the ships would come in primarily through this area, which is the channel, and over to the North Channel and come around and through these waters from the East Lock, and then right here, this is Battleship Row. On Friday, December 5th, the USS Arizona, located right here, would tie up for the last time. They didn't drop anchor here. They tied up to the mooring quay at about 10 o'clock that morning. It was the last mooring for the Arizona. So this gives you an idea of the naval base as it is, all of the support buildings, and over here, the tank farm located here and also over here. And this is Hickam Field right adjacent to it. Not far from it, over on this side is Eva Marine Corps Air Station. And around this side is sugarcane and pineapple fields. And this is Pearl City, IAEA area. So this is a terrific picture of the cockpit of the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in 1941. So I'm trying to change the slide here. Let's see here we go. Thank you. The attack on Pearl Harbor was an event upon itself, and but we need to talk about how all of this happened. And so as we move on to my next slide, there it is. Now I've got control of it. This is a pretty rare picture taken by the Japanese. This is the opening moments of the attack. The Japanese Navy had moved into position 230 miles away. They were going to be launching 353 aircraft against Pearl Harbor in two separate waves. And if you see here, this is the USS Utah, and she's been hit. This is the first ship we believe to be hit at Pearl Harbor. A torpedo has struck her. The Japanese planes coming right low, 30 feet over the water, have dropped their torpedoes. And over here, all of this explosion and smoke you see coming up is from the air station at Pearl Harbor. And this is near Hangar 6 that's being heavily pummeled. The Japanese were striking our airfields all over the island at this time. And the object of that was to make sure no American planes could get up to oppose the attack. And also attacking the seaplanes would take the eyes of the fleet for the Pacific Fleet away. And so you see this horrific explosion and this rare image that was taken by the Japanese aviators for strike photos. But right over here, you'll see the edge, it's obscured, but of Battleship Row. This image is one of the great pictures that was taken that day because it shows Battleship Row that you can see right here, and a torpedo has hit the USS Oklahoma, and you can see the water rising above it, and it's rising, over probably up to 500 feet. Those torpedo planes would make their run right through here, and then also over this small little magazine island is called, and strike this battleship, Nevada. The Arizona is here. It's an inboard ship. Next to it, the Vestal. Over here, you're going to have the battleships Tennessee and West Virginia, and over here, Oklahoma and Maryland, and then the battleship California. The seaplane ramp is right here, and off screen, you can see Hangar 6 just smoking. So the attack is now fully underway at Pearl Harbor. You can see the Japanese plane rising up after dropping its torpedo, and you can see the channel that they used to approach, coming over the water 30 feet. Fleet oiler right here, Neosho, is right in the middle of all of that. Okay, there we go. This was taken by a Japanese aviator as he flew over Battleship Row. After probably delivering his torpedo, you can see the oil belching out of the California. You can see the torpedo splashes and these propeller wash of the torpedo striking here, the USS West Virginia, and over here, the USS Oklahoma. If you look carefully, you can see the water geyser rising up between the masts. The Arizona is located here. And notice how the battleships are tied up. They're tied up in pairs for the most part, except the Nevada here. So the inboard ship is protected from torpedo attack. And the Japanese knew from their espionage of Pearl Harbor, Tokyo Yoshikawa, who was a Japanese naval officer, has disguised himself as a diplomatic officer and sees this pairing that goes on and reports it. So the Japanese developed 3 special weapons for Pearl Harbor: a shallow water torpedo that can run in less than 40 feet of water. That's the depth of Pearl Harbor. And also a high level bomb that can be dropped from 10,000 feet to strike these battleships like the Arizona that will die from one of those, because it'll strike right here in between gun turrets number 1 and 2 and go into the forward magazines. That explosion will lift the ship nearly 50 feet out of the water and break her keel, and she will burn for nearly 3 days out of control. In one searing moment, 1,177 officers, sailors, and Marines were thrust into eternity. All up and down Battleship Row is the havoc of this attack. To immobilize the Pacific Fleet was their goal, and in less than 2 hours, they will do that. Here's a horizontal bomber flying over, taking a picture out of the bottom window of the plane. And you can see right here the damage that's being inflicted on the Pacific Fleet. Over here, the water that is gushing out and into the Oklahoma. Over here, the West Virginia getting ready to possibly capsize. Over here, the Arizona has just been straddled by bombs that have hit her stern section of the ship. Where the next bomb will land will be right in between gun turrets number 1 and 2.
On my iPad, and I can't do it.
So there we go. We'll go to the next photo.
It was out of my email.
Okay, I'm picking up some audio from one of the guests. So here is after the attack, they go out to start to rescue men that have jumped off the ship. Fire surrounding the ships because the ignition of the oil belching out of the Arizona is going down Battleship Row, and also from the other battleships, their sides have been just literally opened up. This is an incredible picture. Actually, this was actually taken in color. There's a color version of this. Here is the USS Nevada as seen from the seaplane ramp, very close to Hangar 6, on her way. In the background are the water towers of the naval base. And the Nevada is the only battleship to get underway. And the second wave attack that arrives just shortly about 9 o'clock sees the ship underway and just jumps on her. And she is going to be straddled and heavily damaged as she tries to get out of the harbor. This shows the part of the aftermath of the capsized vessels. And this is not Battleship Row. This is the USS Utah over here. This is the Detroit, the Raleigh, these are cruisers. And the Tangier is located right over here. This is the Ford Island area and the housing area. And this is where the memorial to the Utah, one of two ships still here at Pearl Harbor. This photo was taken of the Utah in her last moments. She, being the first ship hit, is beginning to roll over and take a number of her crew with her. But you can see that one of the gigs from the Utah is out there going around. Over here is a boat trying to pick up survivors. Another picture of the Nevada underway. As she moves, she's heavily pummeled and she is going to beach herself very close to floating dry dock number 2, which we'll see in a picture upcoming. She can no longer get out. She's been heavily damaged towards her bow. While over here, this is the Nevada right here, and bombs were dropped. Now, whether those bombs were intended for the Nevada or for the floating dry dock that has within it the destroyer Shaw and the tug, the oldest vessel, by the way, in Pearl Harbor. I think her life was given to her in 1903, but the little tug Sotoyomo ahead of her, and this iconic image of the forward magazines of the Shaw, destroyer Shaw blowing up, is one that I think is one of the most epic pictures taken of that tragic day. This is a picture taken from the Tangier looking over towards Middle Lock, and this is the USS Curtis, which she was a seaplane tender, and she has just been hit by a Japanese plane that was shot up and apparently decided to crash into the stern and then into the hangar bay of the USS Curtis, causing extensive damage and death of some of the crew members there. This gives you a close-up of that explosion and fire that ensued. You can even see the guns here shooting up towards the planes aimed towards them. This was part of the close of the attack on Pearl Harbor. After it was all over, in dry dock number 1, which you see here is the flagship of the Pacific Fleet in the background, and that's the USS Pennsylvania. The destroyers Cassin and Downs have also been heavily damaged by bombs that either fell short of the battleship and fell upon them. The dry dock doors were opened and the water came in. You can see the smoke barreling up from Battleship Row in the distance, and that's from the battleship Arizona. This picture was taken from Ford Island late in the afternoon, and the Arizona's mainmast is upright here, but her foremast has literally collapsed and moved forward, almost reclined metaphorically and visually in death. This ship, as I said, would burn for nearly 3 days. This is a unique picture that shows, it was taken again from Ford Island, and you can see the machine guns. This is what they called this element at the top would allow 50 caliber machine guns to fire at the enemy planes, and they did. They called it a bird bath, and this is the mainmast of the Arizona. You can see that the fires that initially were up forward have now starting to move back. The tide will bring that fire back to the stern of the Arizona. Any of the men that got off the ship got off her immediately after the ship was hit, and then boats came along from the Hospital Solis and others to assist them and get them off the ship. 1,177 men are dead. This epic picture of Old Glory flying here in the foreground and the battleship California listing heavily and men starting to abandon ship is one of the more dramatic pictures of the attack. The California has sustained fairly difficult damage in her attempt to counterflood. Again, another picture of going down where the Tennessee in the background, the West Virginia are, and you can see how much damage has now been inflicted. And she is sunk down on the bottom of Pearl Harbor because the harbor is 45 feet deep. It's at her deck line right here where she finally rests. Certainly the aftermath, as I've talked to Pearl Harbor witnesses, both the civilians that worked in the Navy Yard and those that were crew members aboard ships, was staggering to see that damage and what could be done. This map shows you in red all of the vessels that were damaged or sunk during the attack. Think about this, of all the battleships along Battleship Row, all of them were damaged or sunk. In some manner, they had struck the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. Two ships over here, one being the Raleigh and the other being the Utah would sink. Other ships within the naval shipyard. So you can see that the damage was fairly extensive to the Pacific Fleet. As we had a picture of the Japanese flying over Pearl Harbor during the attack, there were photographers that were sent up after the attack, American photographers, and took these pictures of Battleship Row, where you see the Arizona here, gun turret number 2 right here, and the rest of the ship. All the rest of the Arizona it's just not there, and it's mangled. And the only thing left that's part of the ship up forward is the gun turret here. Gun turret number 1 fell 26 feet from its mountings. It is underneath that oily water, and it is still there today. And you can see the oil leaking down in the capsized Oklahoma, which kind of, when she rolled over, she was kind of pulled out and away from it. And then you can see the bottom of her hull here. Another picture taken of the ships and station. To give you an idea of the ships that were struck, among the battleships, Arizona, California, Maryland, Nevada, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Among the cruisers hit that day, but not sunk, Helena, Honolulu, and Raleigh. Among the destroyers that were hit, and in some cases, in the case of the Shaw and the Cass and the Downs, you'd have to say heavily damaged. We had the Cass and the Downs, the Helm, and the Shaw. We also had an old mine layer that was Admiral Furlong's flagship. Admiral Furlong will play into this story later, but it literally was next to the cruiser Helena. And when the torpedo went under the Oglala, because they were moored side by side, it exploded. And the reverberation blew out the plates of the Oglala. And I remember the Pearl Harbor survivors years ago, even during the 50th anniversary, remarking that she was the only ship that sank from fright. Of course, the crew members of the Oglala took umbrage to that, but it literally, the torpedo passed underneath the Oglala, but the explosion blew out her plates and she rolled over and sank. Among the other vessels, besides the Curtis we mentioned, and the Sotoyomo, which was in the floating dry dock, and of course the Utah, that's still there today. This is a picture taken after. You can see right here the Utah completely capsized and the listing of the Raleigh here. In the background is a hospital ship Solace that has been moved over there. There's a whole story behind that, but we don't have time, maybe later. But basically they thought a submarine was hiding underneath her, a midget submarine. Let me go back one. This is the Arizona as they are now going aboard the ship. You see one of the guns pointing upward there. And this is the removal of the dead that they can find. In some cases, especially around these guns, they found ashes. It was pretty horrific. The USS Nevada was later moved from the point over towards Waipio, and then they moved her over because they were very worried that the ship would be an obstruction. Not that she would block the channel, that's kind of a myth that surrounded this vessel, but rather when she went aground, she went sideways along the harbor, and they decided to move her over there, and so she foundered over at Waipio Point. And this is a picture of her resting there. This is in February of 1942. The sadness of what happened that day is something that still touches Americans 80 years later. Young men that were in battle by surprise, and that never left the psyche of the United States, even to this day. And the words of President Roosevelt the following day, when the declaration of war is given at the Capitol, I cannot help but think of how many young men like this one at Kaneohe Bay was lost in those 2 hours of the attack. It was a day that America will never forget. Looking at the fleet damage that was done in this picture, this is Admiral Furlong right here, Admiral Nimitz, who has now assumed command from Admiral husband Kimmel, who was the CNC of the Pacific Fleet. This man from Texas has a lot of responsibilities. And next to him is the architect of the salvage, the man that literally would work to get this fleet to rise from the ashes, Homer Wallen. And the combination of these three individuals took on an incredible and almost impossible salvage of the fleet. This is a famous photographer that photographed the Pacific Fleet, and I'm trying to think of his name, but for the moment it left me, but I'm sorry for that, but I want to move on here and get to this guy. Oh, by the way, that was Tai Sing Liu. He was a photographer of the Pacific Fleet in the years before the attack and during the war, and his photographs are amazing. Admiral Homer Wallen had not only the leadership skills, but the ingenuity. They had to invent this. No one had ever faced the challenges of raising a fleet of ships that many. 21 vessels were sunk or damaged. And so the responsibility went to Homer Wallen. His book about taking on this task and all the challenges is one that definitely is very important in understanding what happened there. The planners were short to me of genius. How do you get ships of that size and weight to turn them over like the Oklahoma, or to try to turn over the Utah, or to deal with ships that have foundered on the harbor bottom? How are you going to do that? There was no book on salvage, but these men you see here and all the people that were involved with it wrote that technology, wrote that history, created what they even use even to this day. When I talk to some of the Navy salvage divers, it's one of the things that they look at is how did these men and women that were involved in this, how did they do it? And how did they invent the tools to do it? Well, the plan kind of developed as they saw the different challenges. This is one of their biggest challenges. This is dealing with the Oklahoma. This is a scale model they built. And they built models to understand the size of the ship in a model form. Also designing a model that had all the compartments. They could then see which of these are flooded, which of these are not. How do we retain, are going to turn this over and retain the buoyancy of the vessel in doing so. So they built these scale models, and I found these pictures in the National Archives years ago, and I was stunned. I had no idea that scale models like this were used. And here's one of the Oklahoma in her position capsized as a scale model. Most of the superstructure of the ship just literally was ground into the harbor. And in 1991, when they were doing some of the dredging, parts of the Oklahoma were coming up in the dredging material. Key to the success is the workforce that was involved with this adventure. And so it was not uncommon that what you see here these are local women, local Hawaiian women, and also a supervisor, Asian extraction. These men and women either had worked in the shipyard or were brought in to work into the shipyard, along with a lot of civilian workers. My grandfather was there as a civilian worker in the Red Hill Project, but he remarked how many people had to be hired in order to work on the salvage of the Pacific Fleet. And these are the unsung heroes. There are many images and of the hard hat divers, and many of them being local young men that were risking their lives to go down there and work as these hard hat divers, helping to raise these ships. These are the hard hat divers. There is a book on one of these hard hat divers that I met, and we coaxed him into writing about his experience. But you can see these weighted boots and these heavy helmets and working underwater, and God forbid a piece of wreckage falls on your air hoses. There were divers killed during that, but I can't tell you at this time their names, but I know that that happened. And you can see how this was a big part of the salvage operations in order for the ships to have the kind of machinery attached to it and the kind of patches attached to it. This was a message about, it says the USA St. Louis just passed through the channel and is cleared. And this is all part of, St. Louis was one of the ships there during the raid, and it found this document that was produced during the salvage of the fleet. This is also a very real thing, and this is a decompression chamber that they built for the people that would be down too long and needed to get their decompressed, and they went into this, and they had these built in several areas of where the salvage was taking place. Of course, the ship that draws the most attention, even to this day, is this one. This is the USS Arizona, and this is taken in 1942, May of 1942. And that's the bridge of the Arizona. And I want you to look very carefully over here, and you could see where it was so hot, the section of this ship melted. And in other pictures up forward, you'll see it. And so in the process of taking the Arizona apart and trying to raise her, they will soon find out that that right up forward, her keel was broken. There's literally, and when I was a diver for the Park Service, I was shown by the other divers the crack that was under the water that went completely down the hull, underneath the hull, which we can't see because it's mud, but would come up on the other side, literally a crack all the way around. So when she lifted out of the water, it snapped her keel. These are men working on the USS Arizona and the salvage, and that was part of them working in the magazines. And you can see all the oil over these guys. And there's a diver going down with a little bit different hard hat helmet going down into the magazines to bring the ammunition up. And what a process that was. Another picture of the Arizona really shows you the destruction of the forward magazines and cranes being brought in to lift the wreckage out. A lot of the Arizona's wreckage was recycled and sent back to the mainland to be used in the war. This is later in 42. They came with a big, this incredible crane that they use, a floating crane, is now lifting the foremast of the Arizona off the bridge. Right below is the mooring quay. You can see still the damage along the side from the attack, the cranes that were used to lift the boats and aircraft, and now they're dismantling the Arizona. One of the things that they took were 2 of the turrets, and this turret they're removing right now will be later used for Batteries Pennsylvania will be one, and Batteries Arizona. Battery Pennsylvania will be at Kaneohe Bay on Makapu Point. It will actually be completed. I've been out there years ago, and they even have some of the hatches and the lifting mechanism for powder and shell. And it sat up top there, 3 14-inch rifles. And then Battery Arizona is right near my house where I'm speaking from you. They didn't finish that, but the ring is still there to accept the turret. And they didn't finish it. The war ended and there was no reason to complete it. So 2 of the turrets were salvaged and used. That would be turrets number 3 and 4 in the aft section of the Arizona. The battleship USS West Virginia was badly damaged as well. And you can see that damage of the torpedoes literally going in there and uplifting one of their gun batteries. This is the bridge of the West Virginia, sorry. And you can see our upper works here and turret number 2 here. And you can see that she's right down to the water line where she sank. Portholes right there. This is a West Virginia. If you look carefully down the port side of the ship, there's a huge patch. That's what they did. They came in and they would weld patches, then pump the water out and give her buoyancy. And this is her being taken into dry dock number 1. That's the same dry dock that you saw where the Pennsylvania was and the Cassin down. So they have got them out of there. And, you know, you're talking about over almost a year's work to get her to this point. This is another, this is on the Arizona, and you can see them going down into these oily parts of the ship, these compartments to bring out a number of things. They brought out some of the officers' belongings. They brought out oil, munitions, and this is all part of a process of them doing that. And you can notice how everybody is watching what's going on as this man works in this oily compartment. Of course, the USS Oklahoma was one of the most, well, it's 429 men that it lost that day. It's the second largest loss of life of any of the ships at Pearl Harbor. And this graphic shows how the torpedoes struck that. As many as 8 to 9, perhaps even 10 torpedoes went into it. We'll never know because some of the torpedoes just followed right into the holes that was created by the other torpedo. And so as you see the capsize, you can see that she has part of the ship is the hull is out of the water and all of her upper works crushed into the mud. And this indicates the torpedo lines and also the patches that will later need to be used to right this ship, which was quite something. Of the ships salvaged at Pearl Harbor, this was the most difficult and challenging. This you see is her being rolled over. This is later in 1943, I believe. And you can see that almost all her upper works from the stern here moving forward is gone. Some of it was removed and some of it was put in the mud. But in order to get this ship righted, they had to extend, and you can see the Arizona over here. This is Ford Island. This is all of mooring quays. These cables that stretch across and attach the ship. Now this is later, so they've actually righted her there, but this is in June of 1943. But this is what they were faced with when they got her into the dry dock. Look at the damage. Once they took away the patches, you can see where these torpedoes hit and just gutted her. There's no other way to look at it. And so this is when she's in dry dock in 1944. By the way, the Oklahoma will never make it back into service. She will actually be floated and placed in, she'll be kind of moored in Westlock, and then later she'll be taken out to sea and scuttled. But right over here is an idea of one of these patches that's constructed in the shipyard, and this salvage vessel coming along to bring her over to be applied to the ship. So this is how they started to roll her over. All of these derricks are attached literally to the hull of the ship. This is the same application they'll attempt to use on the Utah, but this is how you pull over the ship. All of these cables are attached all the way here on the island. You can kind of see some of the boxes there, and these are electric motors that are moving at this very slow pace to pull her over. And how they designed this and who came up with this idea of doing this and rolling her over inches per day to get her to the point you saw earlier is actually an engineering marvel. No one had ever attempted to do this. And you can see the ingenuity that was applied in putting out. By the way, the motors they used, those were all old streetcar motors. Before 1941, the city decided to take the streetcars down and go to this new thing called buses. But they did keep the electric motors, and they were used here and also on the USS Utah. This is her fully righted. You can see that they've now let the cables down and they're pumping water out of her, and they're getting the USS Oklahoma ready to float, but it's going to take a great deal of time and work to do that. This is what it looks like inside the ship. There are pictures that I am not presenting today, but they're pictures of the retrieval of dead bodies in these compartments, remembering that 429 men lost their lives. USS Pennsylvania was the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. And this was Admiral Kimmel's flagship at the time of the attack. And so it showed you an earlier picture of this. You can see the Arizona still burning in the background. But then they were able to patch her up, raise her, and many of the ships that could get to the West Coast went to Bremerton for upgrading further repairs. This is the Cassin and Downs. The Pennsylvania is gone, but this is in 1942, and they've righted them. And there's a number of people here witnessing that because this was a significant event. And both these ships would make it back into service, believe it or not. This is an unusual picture that I found. I hadn't seen this one before. Some of you may have, but you can see the name of the ship on the stern. And this is the beginning of righting her from her damaged that was so extensive, and then seeing her, as you saw, floating later. And this is the Cassin, and this is taken in February 1942, and she's going to be headed back also for, I guess in one way, modernization, because the new guns are coming out, and she is going to serve the Navy still. The USS California we saw in an earlier picture with the American flag fluttering during the attack. And this is a picture of her in dry dock. I don't know if this is dry dock number 1 or number 2, but there she is. You can see her name and a lot of her superstructure removed, and she also will be put back into service. But it's hard to believe when you saw the pictures of her so badly damaged along Battleship Row that she'd make her back. And this is one of the pictures of that salvage going on. And you can see it's just a beehive of activity that's going on with the different vessels coming alongside the ship. Is she still not in her floating status? She's still being worked on. They did remove her mainmast. And here's a picture of that big floating crane that you saw in the Arizona, taking care of the Arizona earlier. And the mainmast was then brought in over towards Magazine Island in the naval base, and they used her for a directing tower for ships entering and leaving the ship. So she did have a practical use. The USS Oglala was the one that I talked to you earlier about, and she was the one that they claimed she sank from fright. The old mine layer that she was, the Oglala was sunk that day, but raised and repaired. But I want you to look over here. They used a really interesting salvage technique. These are large pontoons. They'd be the size of a Mack truck. They're fairly big. And what they would do is they would bring these pontoons alongside. They were used to actually on December 7th to keep the Raleigh from capsizing. They brought him in and to stabilize the vessel. But in this particular case, they flood these and they sink to the bottom and alongside the ship. And the divers go down and then attach the pontoon to the vessel. And then they pump the water out, and the air in these tanks help lift that ship. There's actually still one of these at Pearl Harbor in an old yard, and I go to visit it occasionally. And I think it's this one, number 13, and they have their numbers, but what they are is these large steel cells, and on the outside they're plated with wood. And so they soften, I guess, against the ship. But this is a technique that they used. The USS Shaw had its bow blown off. Here she rests right in dry dock number 2. The tug Sotiomo is up forward. And so when the explosion occurred, it sank 3 vessels. And those vessels being the Shaw, the Sotiomo, a little tug, and the floating dry dock. The USS Nevada was one that we talked about that went over to Waipio Peninsula, and here she is coming into dry dock in February of 1942. And of course, anytime these big vessels came in, look at the crowds on either side of the dry dock looking, and the men on the vessel itself. It was, this resurrection, and I talked to some of them, was a morale builder. That, yeah, you sunk our ships, and we're getting them up. And we're going to get them back to fight. And of course, the Nevada is famous for, firing the opening salvos at Normandy in 1944 in the invasion of Europe. The Vestal was tied up alongside the USS Arizona. And of course, this ship has been mentioned quite a bit in these later years, because this is where bosun named Joe George threw a line over to the Arizona men that were in a gun director and allowed them to go over, hand over hand over to the Vestal. And then the Vestal got away from Battleship Row and it was sinking. It had received a bomb hit in its stern that went right through the ship and out the bottom of the ship and exploded. And so they went over to Iea Shoals, where you see her here, and ran aground. What a story that ship has, and the heroism to save a young sailor, like personal friend of mine and his son too, Don Stratton, a young teenager that saved his life because somebody on that ship sent over a line. The floating dry dock is here, often left off. This is a picture that shows not only the ship Sotiomo, but it shows also the USS Shaw with her bow completely blown off and the floating dry dock YFD-2 sunk. Unimaginable, because you can see in the background right over here, Battleship Row. The Maryland was one of those that was lucky. She sustained light damage. Here's a picture of her still tied up to Foxtrot 5 over here later in the day of the attack. You can note the paint scheme here of the light gray tops, a measure paint scheme that's applied, and the dark gray bottoms. It's a classic picture of that. But she's one of the lucky ones that survived there. Here we go. USS Honolulu was a cruiser that was tied up in a dry dock, I think 21, and a bomb hit the dry dock and then passed through the dry dock, not the dry dock, the dock, I'm sorry, passed through the dock and then went into the side of the Honolulu, where you can see she sustained damage all along here, and they're working on that, and they'll get her repaired, and later she'll go in for more heavy repairs to sustain this vessel. And of course, the USS Honolulu was a favored ship. A man that I knew for years, Ray Emery, was aboard that ship, and he had great stories, and he was the historian for the Pearl Harbor survivors. So here. I'm sorry. Okay, next one we'll have up is the USS Curtis. And the Curtis right here is the one I showed you earlier. Here's a picture taken from the Tangier of that explosion as they saw it, where the plane hit it. The USS Helena was a cruiser, and she was right down here. And so this is the Oglala right here. And you can see the damage and fire coming up from where the Shaw was and the Nevada over in this area. The USS Raleigh was over in the just aft of the USS Utah. This, I found this drawing not too long ago. I hadn't seen this before, that actually shows the explosion of this torpedo that hit the ship and the damage done, and the drawing that associates it with the mooring quay. It's quite something, and I had not seen that, but when preparing for this talk, I had found it on the Naval Heritage Command site. This is one of the more dramatic pictures. You can see how close this ship came to being sunk. This picture was taken from the shoreline of Ford Island, looking out towards this four-stack cruiser. And she had a great history. And at Pearl Harbor, she was one of the ships that was saved, because you see over here, remember those pontoons I was talking about? There's one of them tied up. They're tied up all along the side of the ship to keep her from capsizing. And they were able to do that. And this is another picture that shows the Shaw and the floating dry dock, a really great angle looking back at Battleship Row in the distance. But you can see that the whole bow of that ship is gone. The Utah that we saw earlier in the pictures of her being hit, this is taken February 1944. You see the cables, they're using the same application here, attaching to the ship's hull and riding her by pulling her over with electric motors. Unfortunately, the bottoms on this side, some of you may not know this, but the bottoms over here are heavily inundated. There's, what's the word I'm looking for? There is just the harbor bottom is speckled with coral, as opposed to the opposite side where Battleship Row is, it's mostly mud and sand. And this obstacle of the coral, what they were doing was pouring sand in to roll over. And in July of 1944, she stuck on that coral and they couldn't move her. They decided to abandon that operation. It was the last salvage operation in Pearl Harbor. And that's why the USS Utah will be pulled over a little more than this. But finally, in July of 1944, they will abandon the project and leave her rest there. You can see here, this is February. You can see the derricks right here and the wires going back. And this was in 44 as well. And then you could see the amazing operation they had. And this is Ford Island right here. And you can see it, this aerial, the same engineering that they used on the Oklahoma is being used here. These are remarkable pictures. This is something probably many of you have not seen. This is a digital scan of the Utah that was done recently. So that's what she looks like under the water today. The Arizona's bell was recovered and it's at the visitor center in the salvage operation. And here are sailors looking out as the USS Nevada goes out to join the fleet. And this is one of the salvage divers that came back during one of the anniversaries, proudly wearing U.S. Navy salvage diver. The salvage of the fleet could have not happened with men of courage and like this man. And for all of those that work for Homer Wallen, we should be as proud of them as the men that stood the attack. For further reading, I would recommend these books, Raising of the Fleet, Resurrection, and Homer Wallen's book, which you can get. It's been reprinted. It was originally published by GPO, the government printing office. It was one of the first books I bought on Pearl Harbor when I was a teenager in Los Angeles, and I would recommend that. And I'd like to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Daniel. What a wonderful presentation. I think there's a lot of photos in there that many of us have likely not seen and a lot of good information. We're now going to start the Q&A portion of the program. I have a few questions in the chat room. If you haven't already submitted your questions there, please do so now. Excuse me, the first one comes from Sophia. Her question is, as the Arizona and the Oklahoma were left, they weren't intended to be left because they were going to be memorialized, but because they couldn't originally salvage them. Is that correct?
It's absolutely correct. They became such an engineering difficulty that it was decided that those ships would stay the Arizona as a grave and the Utah as a grave, in which there's still men inside the ship. For the Arizona, it's 1,177 killed. How many are still inside the ship? We don't know. But, you know, crew members do return, and there will be an interment of gunner's mate Milhorn. Harvey Milhorn will be going back to the ship on the afternoon of December 7th, and I will be there along with our staff, Navy counterparts. It's a joint service, and it's a very special thing for one of the survivors to go back and rejoin his shipmates.
That's wonderful to hear. Another question we have is from David. He's wondering how many casualties there were on the USS Shaw.
Well, that's a good question. Let me see. I don't have I actually worked on the project that put all the casualties in an exhibit called the Remembrance Exhibit, and I can certainly get that back to them. I don't have that at hand on my casualty list. Let me look and see if I have something here. I don't, but I can certainly provide it to him. So if you get his contact, we can make sure that we can send it to him. I can look it up.
That sounds good. Another question from Mike. What was put in place to protect the salvage operations from the Japanese so that they wouldn't come back to Hawaii and finish the attack?
Well, they did come back to Hawaii. They came back in March of 1942. They used large seaplanes. I think they were Emily's, but they were large seaplanes, and they left from their islands in the South Pacific and flew across, and Japanese submarines would refuel them. And their last refueling was at French frigate Shoals, that's part of the Hawaiian Islands further out towards Midway. And they flew over in March of 1942, but it was a rainstorm and cloudy. And even though the radar picked them up because of the conditions, they weren't able to intercept them. And one of the big seaplanes with the bomb load thought, well, I think we're probably over Pearl Harbor, and they dropped it. And fortunately for us, the bombs fell out to sea off of Pearl Harbor. The other plane, they got lost in these clouds and went towards Honolulu, and they thought they were over Pearl Harbor, and they dropped their bombs at Makiki Heights and just above where people lived. And people that I talked to that were, young at the time, they said it was just a huge explosion and rocked the houses. And the next day the Army was up there and they told them not to talk about it. And so it was the second raid on Pearl Harbor, and it was meant to disrupt the salvage operations. The second attack on Pearl Harbor.
Wow, I don't think a lot of us knew that. A question from Mr. Dallas. How many ships were able to get to sea, if any, during the attack?
Well, the ships tried to sortie as best as possible. The Nevada was one that was trying to get out during the attack. Destroyers like the Monaghan were trying to get out under attack and were fired upon by a Japanese submarine in the harbor. It's quite a story. So if you look at those, there's these incidents with the midget submarines, but eventually the St. Louis got out and others. So as the day progressed, they thought the Japanese Navy was out there, and it was gone. The Japanese task force had turned. They had been 230 miles away from Oahu when they launched their attack. And once they retrieved their aircraft, which leads to this other question, why wasn't there the second attack on Pearl Harbor, since they had the advantage and go after more ships and the installations at Pearl Harbor? There were some officers that wanted that to happen, but the problem is by the time they retrieved all their aircraft and by the time they armed those aircraft and refueled those aircraft, they would take off later in the afternoon. They could hit Pearl Harbor, but they were not trained to do landings at night. And they would have been landing at night, coming back to their vessel. They were 230 miles away, but still. So they decided not to do that. They had accomplished, in their view, the task. They had immobilized the Pacific Fleet. The greatest invasion in human history was now unfolding across the Pacific. And when you look at how much land was acquired in the opening months of the war, and the number of attacks that were taking place almost all the way down to Australia, from the Philippines down and throughout, the Southeast Asia, the Pacific Fleet being immobilized led to that success for them.
Thank you for that. Tracy is just commenting on how many cables were used to pull some of the ships upright. They're also wondering if the cables were bolted or welded to the ships to pull them upright.
Actually, the cables fed through, they were kind of, in order to pull those over, there was a system as how they were fed through the tops of the derricks and could be adjusted. But basically, attached to those derricks was a way of pulling it over, like an arm attached to those cables. They were there. There's an amazing picture, which I didn't put in here, of how they synchronized all of those motors so they all moved at the same time. They had it looks like something from Star Wars, and it's 1942, 43 when they're doing this, but it's all synchronized so it moves in, even when it's moving as a matter of inches, it's all synchronized. Think about that.
Very interesting. Teresa is wondering if you were one of the members aboard the USS Arizona during the peace tea ceremony at the 75th commemoration.
Yes, I was.
And I think that wraps it up. I just have one final question for you, Daniel.
Sure.
In your many years of service with the National Park Service and the USS Arizona Memorial, can you share one of your most memorable moments from your time working there?
I think there's so many, but I think one of the most amazing moments is when the Japanese aviators met at a symposium that was held at the Hilton Hawaiian Village. We used to do annual symposiums with partners and things like that. The Naval Heritage Command, it was the Naval Historical Center. We partnered with the Admiral Nimitz Museum. And so we brought over the Japanese pilots that were still alive. Many of them flew the Pearl Harbor attack, and they met the American veterans, primarily a lot of Navy veterans, and shook hands in peace, which I thought could never happen, but they did. And it was really a very emotional moment. One of the men that has chronicled this is called Memorializing Pearl Harbor. Dr. Jeffrey White from the University of Hawaii chronicled this reconciliation movement that the National Park Service and the consulate here in Honolulu and the Japanese government and the Japanese Veterans Associations meeting with these veterans and shaking hands in peace. Also, John D. Virgilio, who was a local teacher here, was instrumental in that. There's a whole story behind that, but the book Memorializing Pearl Harbor by Dr. Jeffrey White chronicles those stories.
Wonderful. One last question we have from the group. Carlos is wondering if you can share a few details on what's happening for this year's 80th commemoration.
Well, a lot is happening. The 80th anniversary obviously is takes the leadership from the National Park Service and the leadership from the Navy here, and they have worked together to put together commemorative activities, the primary one being the December 7th ceremony that will be televised. I think it's being televised locally. I'm not sure if it's being televised nationally, but that will be a moment at Kilo Pier, which is right across from Battleship Row. It's over, there's a span of about a half mile from where that is to where seeing the exact, from there you have a wonderful view of the USS Arizona Memorial. And so this commemorative activity will involve the Navy and other military officials in the National Park Service. And people have been working on it. A lot of challenges in this COVID period, but that is unfolding and will happen. And a lot of hard work's been done on that.
Well, thank you again, Daniel. I think that rounds it out. Mike, do you have any final comments?
No, thank you, Dan. It's great as always. Thank you for your participation. For many of you know that the commissioning of the destroyer Daniel Inouye actually happens the next day after December 7th. So next week is a very exciting and busy time here at Pearl Harbor, which I'm sure Dan will be in the middle of all of it.
Yeah, although I have some part of that. And thank you for hosting me, all the folks that worked so hard from the Missouri to make this happen. And I was happy to be your guest speaker.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you again, Daniel. We really appreciated it. If you haven't already connected with us, feel free to connect online. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you're looking for any holiday stocking stuffers or Christmas gifts, check out the Old Salt Coffee Company. They're also a partner with our Mojo series, and use code MOJO10 at checkout for an extra special discount. We thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you more Mojo virtual series next year. Aloha.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.